Sometimes the people who should stand by you are the first to walk away. For Victor Crane, losing his wife wasn't just grief, it was the beginning of losing everything else too. His in-laws blamed him. They took his home. They turned their backs on him and his daughter when they needed family most. With nowhere left to go, Victor remembered his grandfather's old house. Abandoned for 30 years, falling apart, barely standing. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As father and daughter began cleaning out the broken rooms, Victor found a locked door, hidden beneath the basement floor. Behind it lay something his grandfather had kept secret his whole life. A discovery worth $500 million. But would finding it bring them peace or more trouble? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house looked worse than Victor remembered. Much worse. He stood in the overgrown driveway, one hand shielding his eyes from the late afternoon sun, the other gripping the handle of a battered suitcase that contained nearly everything he owned now. Beside him, his daughter Petra shifted her weight from foot to foot, her own bag slung over one shoulder, her face carefully neutral, in that way she'd perfected over the past 6 months. "Well," she said finally, "it's standing. That's something." Victor managed a weak smile. The house sagged like an old man too tired to care anymore. The roof dipped in the middle, shingles missing in patches that exposed dark wood beneath. Windows were broken or missing entirely, covered haphazardly with warped plywood that had grayed with age and weather. Ivy crawled up the walls in thick ropes, covering entire sections of the facade, creeping through cracks in the foundation. The porch steps had rotted through in places, and the front door hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. It had been 30 years since anyone lived here. 30 years since his grandfather Augustus had died, leaving the property in legal limbo that Victor's father had never bothered to resolve. Now, through a twist of bureaucratic fortune and a lawyer who'd finally tracked him down, it was his. Just in time for him to have nothing else left. "Dad!" Petra's voice pulled him back. "You okay?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. The last 3 months had been a blur of loss and humiliation he still couldn't quite process. First Diane, his wife of 23 years, gone in a matter of weeks from an illness they'd caught too late. Then the medical bills, crushing and immediate. Then the house, their house, the one where they'd raised Petra, taken by the bank. And finally the Hargroves. Randolph and Constance Hargrove, Diane's parents, had made their position clear at the funeral. It was his fault. If he'd insisted on doctors sooner, if he'd pushed harder for tests, if he'd been a better husband, more attentive, more demanding, their daughter would still be alive. Victor had tried to grieve, tried to explain that Diane herself had dismissed her symptoms, that she'd been the one who'd waited, who'd said she was fine. But the Hargroves didn't want explanations. They wanted someone to blame, and he was convenient. When the bank foreclosed, Victor had asked if he and Petra could stay with them temporarily, just until he found work, got back on his feet. Randolph had looked at him with cold eyes and said no, said he wouldn't enable the man who'd killed his daughter through negligence. Said Petra was welcome, but not him. Petra had chosen her father without hesitation. That decision had cost her the relationship with her grandparents, but she'd never wavered. 24 years old, working remotely as a graphic designer, she'd packed her laptop and her clothes and stood beside him when the sheriff's deputy supervised their eviction. They'd spent 2 weeks in a motel, bleeding through what little savings remained, before the lawyer's letter arrived about the house. "Come on," Victor said now, forcing himself to move forward. "Let's see what we're working with." The front door required significant force to open, scraping across warped floorboards with a shriek that sent birds scattering from the roof. Inside, the smell hit them immediately. Decades of dust, mildew, rotting wood, and something else. Abandonment had a smell, Victor realized. Loneliness and time. Petra pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight. The electricity had been shut off years ago. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, creating strange patterns across a living room frozen in time. Furniture sat covered in stained sheets, their shapes ghostly and indistinct. The wallpaper hung in strips, exposing water-damaged plaster beneath. The ceiling showed signs of leaks, brown stains spreading like continents on a faded map. At least the floor seemed solid, Petra said, testing her weight on the boards. Mostly. Victor moved deeper into the house, memories surfacing unbidden. He'd been here as a child visiting grandfather Augustus during summer vacations. He remembered a tall, quiet man with careful hands and patient eyes. Augustus had worked as something. What was it? An art restorer, Victor thought. Or maybe an appraiser. He'd traveled frequently for work, always returning with stories about old estates and forgotten collections. The kitchen was a disaster. Cabinets hung open, showing rusted cans and mouse droppings. The sink had pulled away from the wall, and the linoleum floor had buckled and cracked. But the bones were good. The house had been built well, constructed in an era when craftsmanship mattered. "We can make this work," Victor said, more to convince himself than her. Petra joined him, surveying the damage with a designer's eye. "It'll take time. And money we don't have. I can do most of the work myself. I've still got tools in the truck." She touched his arm gently. "Dad, you're a software engineer. When's the last time you replaced a window?" 20 years ago doesn't mean I've forgotten how." He tried to smile. "Besides, I've got time now. Plenty of time." The bitterness in his voice made her wince, and he regretted it immediately. She'd lost her mother too. She'd lost her home, her stability, her grandparents, and she'd stayed with him through all of it. "I'm sorry," he said. It's okay." She squeezed his arm. "We're going to be okay, Dad. We'll fix this place up. You'll find work. Things will get better." He wanted to believe her. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, taking inventory of what needed immediate attention. The list grew quickly. Roof repairs, window replacements, electrical work, plumbing, insulation. The basement appeared to have flooded at some point, leaving everything down there ruined and moldy. As darkness fell, they set up camp in the living room. Petra had brought battery-powered lanterns, and they laid out sleeping bags on the floor after sweeping away the worst of the debris. They ate sandwiches from a gas station, neither of them very hungry. "Tell me about him," Petra said after a long silence. "Grandfather Augustus." "I don't remember him." Victor leaned back against the wall, staring at shadows dancing on the ceiling. He was quiet, thoughtful. He traveled a lot for work, restoring old paintings, authenticating pieces for collectors and museums. He knew art better than anyone I've ever met. Did he ever talk about his work? Sometimes. He'd tell me about discovering a hidden signature under centuries of varnish, or identifying a painting that had been mislabeled for generations. He loved the detective work of it, said every painting had a story, and his job was to help tell it. Why did he let this place fall apart? Victor had wondered the same thing. I don't know. After my grandmother died, he traveled even more. Maybe he couldn't stand to be here without her. Maybe he just got old and tired and ran out of fight. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Is that what happens? You just run out of fight?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Victor knew she wasn't just asking about Augustus. "No," he said firmly. "You choose to keep fighting, even when it's hard, even when you don't know if it'll matter." She nodded, satisfied with that answer. They talked for a while longer, sharing memories of Diane, crying a little, laughing occasionally at remembered moments. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. Victor lay awake long after Petra's breathing had deepened into sleep. Through gaps in the boarded windows, he could see stars. The house settled around him, creaking and groaning, adjusting to having people inside again after so many empty years. Tomorrow they'd start repairs. Tomorrow they'd begin the slow work of rebuilding. But tonight, in the darkness of his grandfather's abandoned house, Victor allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything he'd lost, and wondered if he'd ever find his way back. 2 weeks passed in a blur of physical labor and small victories. Victor threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, rising before dawn and working until his hands ached and his back screamed for rest. It was easier than thinking, easier than remembering. Petra divided her time between helping with repairs and maintaining her freelance work, setting up a makeshift office in what had once been Augustus's study. Her laptop became their lifeline to income, generating just enough to buy materials and keep them fed. The financial pressure was constant and crushing. Medical bills from Diane's treatment still arrived weekly, each one a reminder Victor couldn't escape. He'd set up payment plans for what he could, ignored the rest, and tried not to think about the collection agencies that would inevitably follow. They'd made progress on the house, though. The roof no longer leaked. Most of the windows had been replaced with salvaged panes Victor found at a demolition yard. The kitchen sink was functional again, even if the cabinets remained a disaster. Small steps, one day at a time. On a Thursday afternoon, Victor was in the basement, prying up rotted floorboards for replacement. The space was dark and damp, smelling of earth and decay. He'd been putting off this work, knowing it would be the worst of everything, but it couldn't wait any longer. The board he was working on resisted, nails rusted into the joists beneath. He repositioned his pry bar, applied more pressure, and heard wood crack. The board came free suddenly, and Victor stumbled backward, catching himself against the wall. When he looked down at where the board had been, he saw something that didn't belong. Metal, dark iron, covered in rust and dirt, but unmistakably man-made. He knelt closer, wiping away debris with his hand. The metal formed a square, roughly 3 feet on each side, set flush with the foundation. A door, no, a trapdoor, and in its center, barely visible beneath the grime, was a combination lock. "Petra!" His voice echoed in the basement. "Petra, come down here." He heard her footsteps overhead, then on the stairs. "What's wrong?" "Look at this." She crouched beside him, her phone's flashlight illuminating the discovery. "Is that a trapdoor hidden under the floor?" Victor brushed away more dirt, revealing the full outline. The iron was heavy, industrial grade, the kind meant to last. Why would Grandfather Augustus have this? Storage, maybe? Petra ran her fingers along the edge, finding the seam where door met frame. But why hide it? And why lock it? Victor studied the combination lock. It was old, the kind with 4 rotating dials, each numbered 0 through 9. The metal had oxidized, but the mechanism looked intact. What was he keeping down there? They spent the next hour clearing away the remaining floorboards, exposing the entire trapdoor. It was solid, built to keep something in or keep something out. Victor tried the lock experimentally, spinning the dials randomly. Nothing. The mechanism was frozen or the combination was set. "We need to figure out the combination," Petra said. "Did Grandfather Augustus leave any papers? A safe deposit box? Anything?" Victor shook his head. "The lawyer who contacted me about the house said the estate was minimal. This property and whatever was in it. That was everything. Then maybe the combination is hidden somewhere in the house." They searched systematically, starting with Augustus's study. The room had been left largely untouched, though weather and time had done their damage. The desk drawers stuck but opened with effort, revealing old receipts, expired insurance policies, photographs of people Victor didn't recognize. In the bottom drawer, wedged beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, Petra found a leather-bound journal. "Dad, look at this." The journal was worn, its cover cracked and faded. Victor opened it carefully, mindful of the aged paper. The handwriting inside was Augustus's. He recognized it from birthday cards he'd received as a child. Neat, precise, methodical. The entries weren't dated, but they appeared to span years, maybe decades. Most were brief notes, cryptic references that meant nothing to Victor. Verified provenance on the landscape. Documentation complete. Met with the estate attorney. Terms acceptable. The collection grows. So does the responsibility. What collection? Petra asked, reading over his shoulder. Victor flipped through more pages, searching for clarity. Near the middle of the journal, he found a longer entry that made his breath catch. "Some things are worth more than money. Some things must be protected at all costs. I've spent my life acquiring pieces that would have been lost or destroyed, preserving them for a future I won't see. This isn't treasure. It's a sacred trust. And whoever inherits this burden must understand there are people who would do anything to claim what's below. People who believe ownership is more important than stewardship. They're wrong. They've always been wrong. Below that, separated by several blank pages, was a sequence of numbers, 7392. Is that the combination? Petra's voice was tight with excitement. Maybe, or maybe it's something else entirely. Victor closed the journal carefully. Only one way to find out. They returned to the basement as the afternoon light faded, bringing battery lanterns to supplement Petra's phone. Victor knelt beside the trapdoor, the journal open beside him. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the combination lock. 7392. He pulled on the lock. Nothing. It remained firmly secured. Try it backwards, Petra suggested. 2937. Victor reset the dials. This time, when he pulled, the lock clicked open. They stared at each other for a long moment, the implications settling over them like a weight. Whatever Augustus had hidden down there, he'd wanted it kept secret, wanted it protected. The journal's warnings echoed in Victor's mind. "Should we open it?" Petra whispered. Victor thought about the bills stacking up on the kitchen counter. Thought about the in-laws who'd cast them aside without mercy. Thought about his grandfather, a man who'd worked his entire life at something he clearly believed mattered deeply. "Yes," he said. "We open it." The trapdoor was heavier than expected, the hinges protesting as Victor pulled. Petra helped him lift it, muscles straining until it fell back against the floor with a deep boom that echoed through the house. Below was darkness. Stone steps descended into nothing, disappearing beyond the reach of their lights. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, carrying a strange smell, old paper, canvas, something chemical but not unpleasant. Victor picked up a lantern and shone it down the steps. The light revealed glimpses of a chamber below, larger than he'd expected. He could see wooden crates, shapes covered in cloth, the edge of what might be filing cabinets. "What is all that?" Petra breathed. Victor didn't answer. He couldn't, because he was beginning to understand what his grandfather had done, what he'd spent his life protecting. And the weight of that understanding was both terrifying and overwhelming. He stood at the edge of the opening, looking down into his grandfather's secret, and knew with absolute certainty that their lives were about to change forever. The only question was whether that change would save them or destroy them. Victor descended the stone steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the chamber below. Petra followed close behind, her phone's flashlight joining his lantern to push back the darkness. The air grew cooler as they went deeper, and Victor counted 15 steps before his feet touched solid floor. The chamber was larger than the basement above, extending beyond the house's footprint. Someone, Augustus presumably, had excavated and reinforced this space with concrete walls and a surprisingly sophisticated ventilation system. The air was dry, almost sterile, nothing like the musty dampness of the basement overhead. Victor raised the lantern higher, and the scope of what lay before them became clear. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked 2 and 3 high, each labeled with codes that meant nothing to him. Between the crates stood several large objects draped in heavy canvas cloth. Filing cabinets occupied one corner, their metal surfaces showing no signs of rust, despite the underground location. Against the far wall, wooden frames leaned in careful rows, their contents hidden by protective wrapping. "Dad," Petra whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something sacred. "What is all this?" Victor moved to the nearest crate, setting the lantern down. The wood was solid, well constructed, with brass latches that opened smoothly despite their age. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside, nested in custom-cut foam, was a painting. Small, perhaps 12 inches by 16, the colors still vibrant despite obvious age. It depicted a young woman in Renaissance-era clothing, her expression serene, her eyes following the viewer with that quality only masterworks possessed. "Is that real?" Petra leaned closer, her breath careful and controlled. "I think so." Victor's hands trembled as he lifted the painting, feeling its weight, seeing the fine cracks in the varnish that spoke of centuries. "I think it's all real." They spent the next 2 hours opening crates, each one revealing new wonders. Sculptures in marble and bronze, ceramics with glazes that caught the light like water, Manuscripts in languages Victor couldn't read, their pages covered in elaborate calligraphy and gilt decoration. Every piece was carefully packed, meticulously preserved, protected from time and deterioration. The filing cabinets yielded even more remarkable information. Augustus had documented everything with the precision of a scholar. Each piece had a folder containing provenance records, authentication notes, photographs, and detailed descriptions of where and how he'd acquired it. Victor pulled a file at random and read Augustus's handwritten notes. Recovered from the Ashford estate sale, 1967, family unaware of the piece's true significance. Renaissance bronze, circa 1520, attributed to the workshop of Cellini. Authenticated through comparative analysis with known works. Another file, salvaged from demolition site, Philadelphia, 1974. Building scheduled for destruction, contents to be discarded. Ming Dynasty vase, early 15th century. Provenance traced to the Whitmore collection, thought lost in 1892 fire. Petra stood beside one of the draped objects, her hand hovering over the canvas covering. "Should I?" "Go ahead." She pulled the covering away carefully, revealing a large oil painting in an ornate gilded frame. The canvas depicted a classical scene, figures in flowing robes, a landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains, executed with a technical mastery that took Victor's breath away. "How much do you think this is worth?" Petra asked quietly. "I don't know. Thousands? Tens of thousands?" Victor moved closer, studying the brushwork. "Maybe more. I'm not an expert." "We need an expert, then." Petra was already thinking practically, her designer's mind moving to logistics and planning. "Someone who can authenticate these pieces. Tell us what we're really dealing with." Victor found himself reluctant, though he couldn't quite explain why. Augustus had hidden all this for reasons that must have made sense to him. The journal's warnings echoed in his memory. People who would do anything to claim what was below, people who believed ownership mattered more than stewardship. "We need to be careful," he said. "Grandfather Augustus went to extraordinary lengths to keep this secret." "But why?" Petra gestured at the chamber around them. "If these are valuable, if they could have solved any financial problems he had, why hide them?" Victor didn't have an answer. He returned to the filing cabinets, searching for something that might explain his grandfather's choices. Near the back of the middle drawer, he found a folder thicker than the others, labeled simply History. Inside was Augustus's accounting of his life's work. Not individual pieces, but the larger story. Victor read aloud, his voice echoing softly in the chamber. "I began this collection not from greed, but from necessity. Too many important works were being lost, sold to private collectors who locked them away, destroyed by families who didn't understand their value, scattered to the winds through estate sales and bankruptcies. I saw it happening again and again in my work as a restorer. Beautiful, historically significant pieces simply disappearing." He turned the page, continuing, "So I began to save what I could. When I encountered a piece at risk, I would acquire it if possible. Sometimes through purchase, sometimes through negotiation with owners who had no idea what they possessed. I documented everything, maintained proper records, ensured each piece was preserved correctly. This isn't a collection for profit, it's a repository, a trust for future generations." Petra had moved to stand beside him, reading along. "But some of these pieces must be worth a fortune. Why didn't he donate them to museums?" Victor found the answer further in the document. Legal complications, disputed ownership, claims and counterclaims that could have tied pieces up in court for decades. Augustus was protecting them until clear ownership could be established. "And now that protection passes to you," Petra said quietly, the weight of that responsibility settled over Victor like a physical thing. He thought about the bills upstairs, the in-laws who'd abandoned them, the uncertain future they faced. Down here was potentially enough wealth to solve every problem they had. But Augustus had chosen secrecy over security, protection over profit. "We need more information before we decide anything," Victor said finally. "I have a friend who might be able to help. Alistair Pemberton. We worked together years ago before he left tech to teach art history. If anyone can tell us what we're really dealing with, it's him. Can you trust him? Victor considered that. He'd known Alistair for 15 years, had been to his wedding, knew his children's names. Yes, I think so. But we tell him only what he needs to know. Show him a few pieces, get his expert opinion, nothing more. Petra nodded slowly. Okay, but Dad, we need to think about ourselves too. Mom's medical bills aren't going away. We can't live on my freelance income forever. Whatever Grandfather Augustus intended, he's gone. We're the ones living with the consequences. She was right, and Victor knew it. But he also knew that rushing into decisions out of desperation was how people made catastrophic mistakes. Augustus had spent decades building and protecting this collection. The least Victor could do was understand what he'd inherited before deciding its fate. They covered everything carefully, returned items to their crates, made sure the chamber looked undisturbed. As they climbed the stone steps back to the basement, Victor felt the trapdoor's weight as they lowered it closed, heard the solid thunk as it settled into place. Above them, the house creaked and settled. Outside, evening was falling. Somewhere in town, the Hargroves were probably sitting down to dinner, satisfied that they'd punished the man they blamed for their daughter's death. They had no idea what Victor had just found. No idea that beneath the crumbling house they'd helped force him into, a fortune waited in the dark. Victor wasn't sure yet what he would do with that knowledge. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let greed or desperation dictate his choices. His grandfather had trusted him with something precious. He wouldn't betray that trust, no matter how much easier it might make his life. Alistair Pemberton arrived 3 days later, driving a modest sedan that looked out of place in the overgrown driveway. He emerged carrying a leather messenger bag and wearing the same slightly rumpled blazer Victor remembered from a decade ago, though the beard was new and thoroughly grey. Victor. They embraced, briefly, awkwardly, in the way men do when too much time has passed. I got your message. You sounded like you needed a friend. I do. Victor glanced at the house behind him. But I also need an expert opinion. Come inside. Petra had cleaned the study as best she could, setting up folding chairs and a card table. She'd made coffee on the camping stove, and the three of them sat together while Victor explained what had happened over the past months. Diane's death, the in-laws' rejection, the house. He left the basement discovery for last, watching Alistair's face carefully. You're telling me your grandfather had a hidden art collection? Alistair set down his coffee cup, his academic curiosity clearly piqued. And you need me to authenticate it. Just look at a few pieces. Tell me what we're dealing with. Victor stood. Then we can decide what to do next. The descent into the chamber felt different with someone else present. Alistair's sharp intake of breath when he saw the scope of what lay below confirmed what Victor had suspected. This was extraordinary. Victor had selected 3 pieces to show him. The Renaissance portrait from the first crate, a small bronze sculpture, and one of the larger paintings, still draped but ready to be revealed. Alistair examined the portrait first, pulling a jeweler's loupe from his bag and studying the brushwork under a battery-powered worklight they'd set up. Minutes passed in silence. Then more minutes. Victor and Petra waited, barely breathing. The technique is right, Alistair murmured, more to himself than them. The craquelure pattern is consistent with age. The pigments. He pulled out what looked like a small spectrometer, taking readings. This is either genuine or the best forgery I've ever seen in my life. And if it's genuine, you're holding something worth 6 figures. Maybe more, depending on attribution. Alistair set the painting down with reverence. Show me the others. The bronze sculpture received similar scrutiny. Alistair photographed it from multiple angles, measured proportions, examined casting marks that Victor couldn't even see. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious. This is Renaissance workshop production. I'd need laboratory analysis to be certain, but the quality suggests a master's direct involvement. Where did your grandfather get these? The files say estate sales, demolition sites, places where valuable things were being overlooked or discarded. Victor handed him one of Augustus's provenance folders. He documented everything. Alistair read through the documents, his fingers trembling slightly. This is meticulous, professional-grade research. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. He looked up. Victor, if even half of what's down here is authentic, you're sitting on a collection worth millions, possibly tens of millions. The number seemed abstract, impossible. Victor gestured to the large, draped painting. One more? The biggest one. They pulled the canvas, covering away together, and Alistair went completely still. The painting was massive, perhaps 6 feet by 8. Depicting a classical scene with dozens of figures arranged in architectural spaces that seemed to extend into infinite depth. The colors glowed even under the harsh worklights, reds and blues and golds that seemed to generate their own luminescence. Alistair stood motionless for so long that Petra finally asked, "What is it? I need to check something." His voice was hoarse. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be an academic database. His face went pale. "Victor, do you know what the Devereux collection was?" "No." 1952. Largest private art collection in America. The Devereux. Family estate burned down, and everything was presumed lost. The insurance companies paid out over $50 million, worth 10 times that in today's money. Alistair's hand shook as he pointed at the painting. This matches the description of their centerpiece, a work attributed to the School of Veronese, possibly by the master himself. Victor felt the room tilt slightly. "That's not possible. Look at this." Alistair showed him his phone screen, displaying a grainy black and white photograph from an old catalogue. Even in low quality, the composition was unmistakable. This painting was thought destroyed. If it's authentic, if this is actually the Devereux piece— He stopped, seemed to gather himself. "Victor, this single painting could be worth $500 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Petra had sat down on one of the crates, her face blank with shock. Victor found himself unable to process what he was hearing. "That's insane," he said finally. "A painting can't be worth that much. This one can. It's not just the artistic merit, though. That alone would make it priceless. It's the provenance, the history, the fact that it was presumed lost for over 70 years. Alistair was pacing now, energy radiating from him. "Do you understand what you found? This changes everything we thought we knew about the Devereux fire." Victor's mind was racing. Augustus had hidden this, had kept it secret for decades, had taken extraordinary measures to protect it. Why? If this painting alone could have solved any financial problem imaginable, why bury it beneath a house and tell no one? "The insurance companies," Petra said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. If the painting wasn't destroyed, if it survived somehow, wouldn't they want it back? Or want to be compensated? Alistair nodded slowly. That's one complication. There would also be questions about the Devereux heirs, about legal ownership, about how your grandfather came to possess it. He looked at Victor seriously. "This isn't just valuable, Victor. This is complicated. Dangerous even. Dangerous how? Art of this caliber attracts attention. Not all of it good. There are collectors who would do anything to acquire a piece like this. Legal claims, lawsuits, possibly worse." Alistair ran a hand through his hair. "You need lawyers. Real ones, who specialize in art recovery and disputed provenance. You need security, and you need to be very, very careful about who knows this exists." Victor thought about the Hargroves, about Randolph's cold eyes and Constance's cutting words, thought about bill collectors and foreclosure notices, and the way people looked at him now with pity or contempt or both. "What do I do?" he asked quietly. "First, we document everything properly. Every piece, every file, every scrap of paper your grandfather left. Alistair's academic training was taking over, organizing chaos into manageable steps. Then we need to research the legal situation. Find out what claims might exist, what your rights are as the inheritor. And Victor," he gripped his friend's shoulder, "you need to decide what you want. Because once word of this gets out, you won't be able to control what happens next." They spent another hour in the chamber, Alistair taking photographs and notes, Victor and Petra watching their lives transform with each new revelation. When they finally climbed back up to the basement, closing the trapdoor behind them, Victor felt exhausted in a way physical labor had never achieved. Alistair left with promises to research discreetly, to reach out to contacts in the art world who could be trusted. But as Victor watched his friend's car disappear down the driveway, he felt a creeping sense of unease. Augustus had hidden this for a reason, had chosen secrecy, even though it meant dying without ever benefiting from what he'd preserved. That choice suggested something Victor was only beginning to understand. Some secrets, once revealed, couldn't be taken back, and some treasures carried costs that money couldn't measure. The stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning, parked across the street in a dark sedan that Victor noticed immediately, because nothing ever parked on their street. The house was too isolated, too forgotten. But there it sat, engine off, windows tinted, making no attempt to hide its presence. Victor watched from the study window, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd been expecting something like this since Alistair's visit 4 days ago. Expected it, but hoping he was wrong. "Petra," he called softly. "Come here." She joined him at the window, following his gaze. "How long has it been there?" 20 minutes. Maybe longer. Victor let the curtain fall back. "We need to be more careful." That afternoon, while Petra worked on a design project upstairs, Victor returned to the filing cabinets in the chamber. He'd been avoiding Augustus's personal papers, focusing on the collection documentation, but now he needed to understand the full story. He found it in a manila envelope taped to the back of the bottom drawer. Inside was a letter sealed in plastic, with Victor's name written on the front in his grandfather's careful hand. Below his name, in smaller letters, "Open only if they come for it." Victor's hands shook as he broke the seal. The letter was dated 1998, 17 years before Augustus's death. Victor read it twice, then a third time, each pass revealing new layers of his grandfather's burden. "My dear Victor," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've found the collection, and you've attracted the wrong kind of attention. I'm sorry. I'd hoped this would remain hidden until a time when it could be returned properly, but fate rarely cooperates with our plans." The letter explained everything. In 1952, Augustus had been hired to restore several paintings at the Devereux estate. He arrived 3 days after the fire, shocked by the devastation. The main house was destroyed, the family dead, everything presumed lost. But Augustus had found the collection vault, fireproof and intact, hidden in the estate's basement. Inside were treasures beyond imagination, everything the Devereux family had spent generations acquiring. And standing in that vault with Augustus was the family's attorney, a man named Thaddeus Harrington. Victor's blood ran cold at the name. Augustus described what happened next with painful clarity. Harrington wanted to claim the collection was destroyed, split the insurance payout, and sell the pieces gradually through private channels. A fortune stolen from the ashes, with no one the wiser. Augustus refused, threatened to report Harrington to authorities. The attorney had smiled and said no one would believe a restoration specialist over a man of his reputation and connections. He gave Augustus a choice: participate in the theft or face consequences. That night, Augustus made his decision. He returned to the vault alone and removed the collection piece by piece over the course of 3 weeks. He documented everything, maintained perfect records, and hid the whole collection away. Not to steal it, never that, but to protect it from thieves. The Devereux family had no living heirs, Augustus wrote. Their will stipulated everything go to charity, specifically to the Metropolitan Museum. But Harrington had the will suppressed, claimed it was invalid, produced documents suggesting distant relatives existed who would inherit. All lies, all fabrication. I had proof, but no way to present it safely. The letter continued, detailing Augustus's attempts to expose the fraud. He'd gone to the FBI in 1974, presented his evidence. The investigation was quietly closed within months, no explanation given. He tried journalists, lawyers, even writing to museum directors. Nothing worked. The Harrington family was too powerful, too connected. So I waited, Augustus wrote. Preserved everything, maintained it perfectly, hoping that someday, when the Harringtons were gone, or their power diminished, the truth could emerge. I broke the law to serve justice, Victor. I accept that burden. But I won't let these treasures fall into the hands of thieves. The letter ended with a warning that made Victor's chest tight with fear. The Harrington family has never stopped searching for this collection. Thaddeus died in 1989, but his son Cornelius continues the hunt. They believe the collection is rightfully theirs, based on the forged documents they created. They're dangerous, Victor, ruthless. If they learn you have what they've been seeking, they won't stop until they take it. Be careful. Trust no one. And if you can find a way to return the collection to its rightful place, the museums, the public, the world, then you'll have accomplished what I could not. Victor sat in the chamber's dim light, the letter in his hands, understanding finally why Augustus had chosen secrecy over wealth. This wasn't just valuable art. It was evidence of crimes, fraud on a massive scale, theft disguised as legal maneuvering. And now it was Victor's problem. He climbed back upstairs to find Petra making dinner on their camping stove, the mundane domesticity jarring against the weight of what he'd just learned. He showed her the letter, watched her face pale as she read. "Dad, this is serious. These people, if they're as powerful as Grandfather Augustus said." "I know." Victor moved to the window, peering carefully around the curtain. The sedan was gone, but that somehow made things worse. "We need help. Real help, not just an art history professor. What kind of help?" Before Victor could answer, his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Crane?" A woman's voice, professional but warm. "My name is Margot Ashton. I'm a researcher, and I'd very much like to speak with you about your grandfather's house. Would it be possible to meet?" "What kind of researcher?" "The kind who's been investigating the Harrington family for 20 years. The kind who knows exactly what you found in your basement." A pause. "The kind who might be able to help you, if you'll let me." Victor's grip tightened on the phone. "How do you know about—" "Please, Mr. Crane, not over the phone. There's a coffee shop in town, Morning Grounds. Tomorrow at 10. Her voice softened. "I'm not your enemy. My grandmother died in the Devereux fire. I've dedicated my life to finding out what really happened. I think we can help each other." She hung up before Victor could respond. He stood there, phone in hand, feeling the walls closing in. The sedan watching the house. Margot Ashton knowing about the collection. The Harrington family somewhere out there, still searching after 70 years. "What do we do?" Petra asked quietly. Victor thought about Augustus, spending decades protecting these treasures in solitude, dying without ever seeing justice done. Thought about Diane, and how much he'd failed her by not acting quickly enough. Thought about the bills upstairs, and the responsibility below, and the impossible choice between safety and truth. "We meet her," he said finally. "Tomorrow. But we're careful. We trust no one completely until we know what we're really dealing with." Petra nodded, but her face showed the same fear Victor felt. They'd stumbled into something far larger than themselves, inherited a war they didn't understand. And somewhere in the darkness outside, people were watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Morning Grounds occupied a corner storefront in the small downtown, the kind of place where retired farmers nursed coffee for hours and local gossip flowed freely. Victor arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the back with clear sightlines to both entrances. Old habits from a life that felt very distant now. Margot Ashton walked in precisely at 10. She was younger than Victor expected, maybe late 40s, dressed in jeans and a practical jacket, carrying a worn leather satchel that looked like it had traveled extensively. Her eyes found him immediately, and she approached with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "Mr. Crane," she extended her hand. "Thank you for meeting me. You didn't leave me much choice." Victor didn't stand. "You know things you shouldn't know." "I know a lot of things I shouldn't know. It's my job." She sat across from him, ordered coffee from the passing waitress without looking at a menu. "I've been tracking the Devereux collection for most of my adult life. When Augustus Crane died 15 years ago, I knew the trail had gone cold. Then you inherited the property, and suddenly there was activity. Your friend Alistair Pemberton isn't as discreet as he thinks." Victor's jaw tightened. "You've been following us. I've been watching the house. There's a difference." Margot's coffee arrived and she wrapped her hands around the mug. "I'm not the only one watching either. Did you notice the sedan? Dark blue tinted windows?" "Yes, Harrington family. Private investigators they keep on retainer. They've been monitoring Augustus's property for years, waiting for something to happen. Your arrival triggered their interest. Alistair's visit confirmed their suspicions." She sipped her coffee. "You're in danger, Mr. Crane, more than you realize. Then why should I trust you?" "Because my grandmother was Alice Ashton, head housekeeper for the Devereux family. She died in the fire that killed them." Margot pulled a photograph from her satchel, slid it across the table. A young woman in a formal uniform, standing beside an elderly couple. "She raised me after my mother died. Told me stories about the family, about the collection, about how beautiful everything was. Then one night, everything burned." Victor studied the photograph. The elderly couple must have been the Devereux, dignified and kind-looking in the fading image. "The official report said electrical fire," Margot continued. "But my grandmother called her sister the day before she died. Said strange men had been at the house, asking about valuables. Said the family attorney had been arguing with Mr. Devereux about something important. She was frightened." Margot's voice remained steady, but Victor heard the old grief beneath. "The next day they were all dead, and Thaddeus Harrington claimed the collection was destroyed. Augustus's letter said the same thing, said Harrington wanted to steal everything." Margot leaned forward. "Then you found the letter. Good. That means you understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just about art, Mr. Crane. It's about murder, fraud, decades of corruption. The Harrington family has built an empire on crimes they committed in 1952. If that collection surfaces with its provenance intact, if Augustus's documentation proves what really happened, the entire family could face criminal charges. That was 70 years ago. Surely there's no statute of limitations on murder, and insurance fraud on that scale? The companies would pursue recovery forever." She pulled more documents from her satchel. "I've spent 20 years investigating. I have evidence of the Harringtons' connections to organized crime in the 50s, proof they've used intimidation and worse to silence anyone who got close to the truth. But I've never had the collection itself, never had the proof Augustus compiled." Victor felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. Every instinct screamed caution, but something about Margot felt genuine. Her grief was real, her dedication unmistakable. "Show me your evidence," he said. They spent the next hour going through Margot's research. She had newspaper clippings, FBI documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests, testimony from people who'd worked for the Harrington family over the decades. The picture that emerged was damning. A family that had used the Devereux tragedy as the foundation for their wealth and power. "The current patriarch is Cornelius Harrington III, Margot explained. 71 years old, controls a commercial real estate empire worth billions. His grandfather, Thaddeus, created their fortune by stealing and selling pieces from the Devereux collection gradually over decades. Cornelius has spent his life searching for the rest of it. Why? He's already wealthy. Greed, pride, fear." Margot gathered her papers. "If the collection surfaces and the truth comes out, everything his family built collapses. They'd lose their reputation, probably their freedom. Cornelius needs to find those pieces and destroy them, along with any evidence of how they were obtained." Victor's phone buzzed. A text from Petra. "Someone tried to get in the house. Police are here." He stood abruptly. "I have to go. I'm coming with you." They drove in tense silence, Victor's hands tight on the wheel. He'd left Petra alone. If something had happened to her because of his grandfather's secrets, the police cruiser was parked in the driveway when they arrived. Petra stood on the porch talking to a deputy, her face pale but composed. Victor was out of the car before it fully stopped. "I'm fine, Dad." She hugged him quickly. "Someone tried to force the back door while I was working. I heard them and called 911. They ran when they heard me. The deputy took Victor's statement promising increased patrols, though they all knew that meant little on such an isolated road. After he left, the three of them stood in the study, the weight of the situation pressing down. "They're getting bolder," Margot said. "Once Cornelius decides he needs something, he doesn't stop." Victor made a decision. "Come with me." He led them to the basement, to the trapdoor. Margot's sharp intake of breath when she saw the chamber was all the confirmation he needed, that she'd been telling the truth. This was what she'd been searching for her entire adult life. They showed her everything. The collection, Augustus's documentation, the letter. Margot moved through it like a pilgrim in a sacred space, touching nothing without permission, her eyes bright with tears. "It's real," she whispered. "It's all real. Alice told me about these pieces. I remember her descriptions." She turned to Victor. "Your grandfather saved them. Saved all of it. What do I do with it now?" "We fight back." Margot's voice was steel. "We find a lawyer who can't be bought. We document everything properly. We build a case so strong that even the Harrington family's power can't suppress it." She looked at the masterpiece painting, still unveiled from Alistair's visit. "And we make sure the world knows the truth about what happened in 1952. Victor thought about Petra upstairs, about the attempted break-in, about the sedan watching his house. Thought about Augustus, alone with his secrets for decades. Thought about justice and risk, and the cost of doing what was right. "All right," he said, "let's do it. But we do it carefully, and we do it smart. I won't let my daughter get hurt because of this." "Agreed." Margot pulled out her phone. "I know someone, an attorney named Sylvia Pritchard. She specializes in art recovery and estate law. She's helped expose fraudulent claims before. If anyone can navigate this legally, it's her." They climbed back upstairs into the fading afternoon light. Victor locked the trapdoor, feeling the click of the mechanism like the sound of a door closing on one life and opening on another. The war Augustus had fought alone was now theirs to finish. And somewhere in the city, the Harrington family was preparing their next move. Sylvia Pritchard arrived 2 days later, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-grey hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. She examined Augustus's documentation with the focused intensity of a surgeon, saying nothing for the first hour except to occasionally request specific files or photographs. They'd set up a war room of sorts in the study, spreading documents across every available surface. Margot had brought her research. Alistair had returned with authentication reports from colleagues he trusted. Petra had created digital backups of everything, storing them in encrypted cloud accounts. "This is extraordinary," Sylvia said finally, setting down the provenance file she'd been reading. "Your grandfather built an airtight case. Every piece is documented, every acquisition explained, every authentication backed by evidence. This isn't a collection, it's a legal brief waiting to be filed. Can we win?" Victor asked. "Against the Harringtons?" "In court." "Absolutely. The original Devereux will is clear. Everything was meant for charity, for public museums. The Harrington family's claim is based entirely on forged documents, documents your grandfather proved were fraudulent." Sylvia pulled out her laptop. "But winning in court isn't your only problem." She showed them a news article from that morning. "Harrington real estate files claim against local estate," read the headline. Victor's stomach dropped as he read the details. Cornelius Harrington had filed a lawsuit claiming that Augustus Crane had stolen property from his family in 1952. He'd produced documents, fake. Victor knew, but officially filed, showing that Augustus had been contracted by the Harrington family to transport certain items after the Devereux fire. He claimed Augustus had never delivered those items, essentially accusing Victor's grandfather of theft. "This is insane," Petra said. "They're rewriting history. They're establishing a legal framework," Sylvia corrected. "If they can prove Augustus took something that belonged to them, even under false pretenses, they can claim everything in your possession. It's clever, actually. Evil, but clever. What do we do?" "We file a counterclaim immediately. We present the real Devereux will, Augustus's documentation, everything. We force this into open court where their fabrications can be challenged." Sylvia looked at each of them seriously. But understand, once we file, this becomes public. The media will descend. Every detail of your lives will be scrutinized. And the Harringtons will fight with everything they have. Victor thought about Petra, about the quiet life they'd been trying to rebuild. Thought about the in-laws, who already blamed him for Diane's death. How they'd react to headlines about stolen art and family scandals. "There's another option," Margot said quietly. "We could approach the Harringtons privately, offer them a deal, return some pieces in exchange for dropping their claims." "No," Victor's voice was firm. "Augustus spent his life protecting this collection from thieves. I won't negotiate with them, even if it means safety. Certainty? Especially then." He looked at the photograph of Augustus on the desk, the one showing his grandfather standing proudly in front of this house when it was new. "He did the hard thing. Lived with the burden alone. The least I can do is finish what he started." Sylvia nodded approvingly. "Then we need to move fast. I'll file our counterclaim tomorrow. We'll request an expedited hearing based on the urgency of their accusations. With luck, we can be in court within 6 weeks. The next days blurred together in preparation. They catalogued every piece in the collection, photographed everything from multiple angles, compiled Augustus's documentation into a comprehensive brief. Alistair brought in more experts, each one sworn to secrecy, each one confirming the collection's authenticity and value. The Harrington family escalated their pressure. The sedan outside became a constant presence. Petra received threatening emails warning her to convince her father to be reasonable. Local businesses started refusing Victor's credit, clearly influenced by Harrington money and connections. But something unexpected happened too. Francine, their neighbor, began rallying community support. She'd known Augustus, remembered him as a kind man who'd helped her late husband with legal work decades ago. She told people in town the truth, that Augustus had been a guardian of important treasures, not a thief. Small acts of support began appearing, anonymous donations of food and supplies left on the porch, a local contractor offering free labor on house repairs. Notes slipped under the door expressing encouragement and belief in their cause. "Your grandfather mattered to people here," Francine told Victor one evening. "More than you knew. He helped a lot of folks over the years, never asking for anything in return. People remember that." The preliminary hearing was set for a Monday in late October. The weekend before, Victor barely slept. He'd memorized every detail of their case, practiced his testimony with Sylvia until his voice went hoarse. But anxiety gnawed at him regardless. Sunday evening, he found himself alone in the chamber, surrounded by the treasures Augustus had protected. The masterpiece painting seemed to glow in the lantern light, its beauty undimmed by centuries. Victor understood now why his grandfather had given up comfort and security to preserve these things. They were more than objects. They were human achievement, creativity made tangible, connections to history and meaning. "I hope I'm doing right by you," he said to the empty air, to Augustus's memory. "I hope this is what you wanted." Petra found him there an hour later. She sat beside him on one of the crates, leaning her head against his shoulder like she'd done when she was small. "Mom would be proud of you," she said quietly. "Standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's who she fell in love with." Victor felt tears sting his eyes. "I miss her. I know. I do too." Petra squeezed his hand. "But we're still here, Dad. We're still fighting. That matters." That night, Victor slept dreamlessly for the first time in months. When dawn came, he dressed in the one suit he'd salvaged from the foreclosure, the same suit he'd worn to Diane's funeral. It felt appropriate somehow. Both occasions were about honoring the dead by living with integrity. They drove to the courthouse together, Victor, Petra, Sylvia, Margot, and Alistair. A small army facing down an empire. News vans were already there, tipped off by someone about the hearing. Reporters shouted questions that Victor ignored. Inside the courthouse, the Harrington legal team waited. 6 attorneys in expensive suits, radiating confidence and money. Behind them sat Cornelius Harrington himself, an elderly man with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. But what shocked Victor was seeing Randolph Hargrove sitting beside Cornelius. His former father-in-law wore a satisfied smile, like he'd been proven right about Victor all along. Petra gripped Victor's arm. "What's he doing here?" Before Victor could answer, Randolph approached. "Victor, I tried to warn you, tried to make you see reason, but you never could accept reality, could you? Not even when it killed my daughter." "Mr. Hargrove," Sylvia stepped between them. "You need to step back. I'm here as a witness," Randolph said. "The Harringtons deserve what you're hiding. I've told them everything I know about your grandfather's house, everything I learned from Diane over the years. You can't win this, Victor. You're going to lose everything again, and this time you'll drag Petra down with you." Victor felt rage rise in his chest, but Petra's hand tightened on his arm, grounding him. "Let's go," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." They moved toward the courtroom, leaving Randolph behind. But Victor's confidence had shaken. The betrayal stung more than he'd expected. His own father-in-law, working with the people trying to steal Augustus's legacy. The courtroom doors opened. Judge Miriam Holloway entered, taking her seat with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of what they were about to hear. Victor sat at the defendant's table, his daughter beside him, and prepared to fight for his grandfather's truth. Everything hung in the balance now. Justice or corruption, truth or power. The next hours would determine not just his future, but the legacy of everyone who'd believed these treasures were worth protecting. The judge's gavel fell and the battle began. The Harrington attorney rose first, a silver-haired man named Buchanan, who spoke with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd won too many cases to doubt himself. He painted Augustus Crane as a thief, Victor as a man desperate enough to exploit. Stolen goods, the whole situation as a tragedy that could be resolved if Victor simply returned what didn't belong to him. "The Harrington family employed Mr. Crane's grandfather in good faith," Buchanan said, pacing before the judge. "They trusted him with valuable property during a time of crisis. That trust was betrayed. Now, 70 years later, we seek only to recover what was rightfully ours." He presented the forged documents with confidence, each one officially notarized, each one appearing legitimate to anyone who didn't know the truth. Victor watched Judge Holloway's face, trying to read her reaction. She gave nothing away. When Buchanan finished, Sylvia stood. She was shorter than the Harrington attorney, less polished in her appearance, but when she spoke, the courtroom seemed to lean forward. "Your Honor, this case isn't about a simple contract dispute. It's about the systematic theft of one of America's greatest art collections and the murder of the family who owned it." The courtroom erupted. Buchanan objected loudly. Judge Holloway's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Counselor," the judge said sharply, "that's a serious accusation. I hope you can substantiate it." "I can, Your Honor." Sylvia approached the bench with a thick folder. "I'd like to submit the complete documentation compiled by Augustus Crane over 40 years of investigation. This includes the original Devereux family will, proof that the Harrington documents are forgeries, and evidence connecting the Harrington family to the 1952 fire that killed the Devereux family." For the next 2 hours, Sylvia methodically destroyed the Harrington case. She presented the original will, authenticated by handwriting experts. She showed how the Harrington documents contained anachronisms, references to laws that didn't exist in 1952, signatures from people who were provably elsewhere on the dates indicated. Alistair testified about the collection's authenticity, his credentials, and careful analysis lending weight to every claim. Margot presented her grandmother's testimony, the phone call the day before the fire, the FBI documents showing an investigation that had been quietly suppressed. Victor watched Cornelius Harrington's face grow darker with each revelation. The old man leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorneys, but there was nothing they could do. The truth was undeniable. Then Sylvia played the recording. Augustus's voice, preserved on cassette tape from 1989, filled the courtroom. He spoke clearly and calmly, detailing exactly what had happened: finding the collection, Thaddeus Harrington's attempted theft, the decision to protect the treasures until they could be properly returned. "I broke the law," Augustus's voice said. "I removed property that wasn't mine, but I did it to prevent a greater crime. I did it because someone had to stand between treasure and thieves. I accept the consequences of that choice, but I won't apologize for it." Bide. When the recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Victor felt tears on his face, hearing his grandfather's voice for the first time in decades, hearing the conviction and honor that had defined the man's life. Judge Holloway called for a recess. During the break, Victor saw Randolph Hargrove arguing with Cornelius, both men's faces flushed with anger. Whatever deal they'd made was falling apart. When court reconvened, Buchanan tried to salvage his case. He argued statute of limitations, claimed the recording was inadmissible, suggested Augustus had been unstable or confused. But even he seemed to know it was over. Judge Holloway asked Victor to take the stand. He'd been dreading this moment, but when he sat down and looked at the judge, he felt surprisingly calm. "Mr. Crane," she said, "what would you do with this collection if I ruled in your favor?" Victor glanced at Petra, then at Margot, then back to the judge. "I'd donate it, Your Honor, to museums, to institutions where people could see and appreciate it. That's what the Devereux family intended. That's what my grandfather protected it for. I don't want the money. I never did. I just want to finish what he started. You're aware the collection is worth hundreds of millions of dollars?" "Yes, ma'am. And I'm aware that some things are worth more than money. My grandfather taught me that. He gave his whole life to protecting something beautiful and important. The least I can do is honor that sacrifice." Judge Holloway studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Crane. You may step down." The judge took her time reviewing the documents one final time. Victor held Petra's hand, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. Everything they'd worked for, everything Augustus had preserved, came down to this moment. Finally, Judge Holloway looked up. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented today," she said. "The original Devereux will is authentic and legally binding. The Harrington family's claim is based on forged documents created for the purpose of insurance fraud and theft. Augustus Crane acted to protect cultural treasures from criminals, and while his methods were technically illegal, they served justice in a way the system failed to do." She looked directly at Cornelius Harrington. "Your family's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm recommending this case be referred to the State Attorney General for investigation into possible fraud and conspiracy charges." Buchanan was on his feet objecting, but the judge silenced him with a look. "As for the collection," she continued, turning to Victor, "it is legally part of Augustus Crane's estate inherited by his grandson. Mr. Crane is named legal custodian, with full authority to determine the collection's future. My recommendation is that it be donated to appropriate public institutions, as the Devereux family originally intended." The gavel fell. Victor sat, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Then Petra was hugging him, and Sylvia was shaking his hand, and Margot was crying openly with relief and vindication. Across the courtroom, Cornelius Harrington stood slowly, his face a mask of cold fury. He stared at Victor with hatred so pure it was almost physical. Then he turned and walked out, his attorneys scrambling to follow. Randolph Hargrove remained, in his seat, looking smaller somehow, diminished by his association with corruption and defeat. Victor didn't spare him a second glance. Some betrayals were beyond forgiveness. They'd won. Against power and money and decades of lies, they'd won. Augustus's legacy was safe. The truth had prevailed, and for the first time since Diane's death, Victor felt something like hope. The weeks following the court victory blurred together in a cascade of decisions and revelations. News of the case spread rapidly, drawing attention from art institutions, historians, and media outlets around the world. Victor's quiet life became anything but. The phone calls started immediately, museum curators expressing interest in the collection, lawyers offering representation, journalists requesting interviews. Victor ignored most of them, relying on Sylvia to filter the legitimate inquiries from those simply seeking scandal or profit. 3 days after the hearing, representatives from the Metropolitan Museum arrived at the house. They brought conservators, appraisers, and security personnel. The procession of black SUVs in the driveway would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Dr. Heinrich Volkmer, the museum's chief curator, was a precise man in his 60s who treated each piece in Augustus's collection with reverent care. He spent 2 full days in the underground chamber, documenting everything, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the masterpiece. "Your grandfather saved more than art," he told Victor. "He saved history, cultural memory, things that can never be replaced once lost." He looked up from the canvas he'd been studying. "We would be honored to give these pieces a permanent home." But Victor had learned caution. "I need to understand the terms. My grandfather protected this collection from exploitation. I won't see it locked away in storage or sold off piecemeal. We would never—" Dr. Volkmer stopped himself, seeming to recognize that promises meant little without documentation. "Let me show you what we're proposing." The plan was comprehensive and respectful. The masterpiece would anchor a new wing dedicated to recovered art and the stories of those who'd protected it. Other pieces would be distributed to appropriate institutions, Renaissance works to museums specializing in that era, sculptures to galleries that could display them properly. Everything would remain accessible to the public, properly attributed to the Devereux family, with Augustus recognized as the guardian who'd saved it all. Most importantly, the Devereux family's original charitable intent would be honored. Proceeds from any reproductions or touring exhibitions would fund art education programs for underserved communities. "This is what Catherine Devereux wanted," Dr. Volkmer said. "To share beauty with everyone, especially those who might not otherwise have access to it. Your grandfather understood that. We want to continue his work." Victor read through the contracts carefully, Sylvia reviewing every clause. When he finally signed, 3 weeks after the court hearing, he felt both relief and profound sadness. The collection that had been his grandfather's burden for 40 years, his own discovery for mere months, was passing into other hands. But they were the right hands. That was what mattered. The Harrington family's defeat became more complete as investigators followed Judge Holloway's recommendation. The state attorney general opened an inquiry into the forged documents and the original insurance fraud. While proving criminal charges after 70 years proved difficult, the investigation destroyed the family's reputation. Cornelius Harrington resigned from his company's board. Several business partners severed ties. The empire built on stolen art began to crumble. Randolph Hargrove faced his own reckoning. Word spread through their old community about his collaboration with the Harringtons, his betrayal of his son-in-law for money. Former friends distanced themselves. His country club quietly suggested he resign his membership. Constance filed for divorce, claiming she'd known nothing of Randolph's dealings. Victor didn't know if that was true, didn't particularly care. They'd both turned their backs when he and Petra needed family most. The consequences of that choice were theirs to bear. One evening, 6 weeks after the hearing, Petra came downstairs to find Victor in Augustus's study, his study now, surrounded by the journals and papers he'd been slowly working through. "Found something?" she asked, setting down 2 mugs of tea. "A letter, written to my grandmother before she died." Victor's voice was soft. "Augustus talks about the burden of his choices, about living with secrets. He says he knows it costs him, costs them both, but he can't abandon the collection to thieves. He asks her forgiveness for choosing principle over comfort. What did she say? There's a note clipped to it. Just one line. 'I married a man of honor. I wouldn't trade that for any amount of ease.'" Victor set the papers down carefully. "They chose this together. Chose a harder life because it was the right one." Petra was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it? Fighting instead of settling with the Harringtons?" "Not even for a second." Victor met her eyes. "We did the right thing. That matters more than money ever could. Mom used to say that you always chose the harder right over the easier wrong." Petra smiled sadly. "The grandparents never understood that about you." about her either. They sat together in comfortable silence, sipping tea as darkness fell outside. The house that had been abandoned and falling apart was warm now, filled with light and life. They'd repaired the worst of the damage, restored the beautiful bones that Augustus had built so long ago. Francine had become a regular visitor, bringing dinner occasionally and sharing stories about Augustus that helped Victor understand the grandfather he'd only partially known as a child. The man who'd helped neighbors with legal problems, who'd volunteered at the library, who'd lived quietly but purposefully, his secret burden carried with dignity. "The museum wants us at the opening," Petra said. 3 months from now. They're creating an entire exhibition around Grandfather Augustus's story. Victor nodded slowly. The idea of being in the spotlight made him uncomfortable, but he understood its importance. Augustus had worked in shadows by necessity. His story deserved to be told in full light. "We'll go," he said. "We'll tell them about the man he was, the choices he made, the legacy he left. And after that?" Petra asked. "What do we do then?" Victor looked around the study, at the restored house, at the daughter who'd stood beside him through everything. "We live, we build something good here. We honor their memory, Mom's and Grandfather Augustus's, by living with the same integrity they showed us." "Sounds perfect," Petra said softly. Outside, spring was arriving slowly but surely. The garden was beginning to bloom, new life pushing through soil that had lain fallow for too long. Inside, father and daughter sat together, grateful for survival, proud of choices made, ready for whatever came next. The exhibition opening arrived on a warm evening in early September. Victor stood before the Metropolitan Museum's grand entrance, feeling profoundly out of place in the suit Petra had insisted he buy for the occasion. The building loomed above them, its neo-classical columns and wide steps speaking of permanence and cultural weight. "Ready?" Petra asked, adjusting his tie one final time. "No," Victor admitted, "but let's do it anyway." Inside, the museum had transformed the collection into something magnificent. The exhibition occupied an entire wing, each piece given space to breathe, to tell its story. But more than the art itself, Augustus's journey took center stage. His journals were displayed behind glass. Photographs of the house, before and after restoration, showed the dedication required to preserve the collection. Timeline displays detailed the 1952 fire, the investigation, the decades of patient guardianship. The masterpiece hung in the central gallery, professionally restored and lit to showcase every detail. Crowds gathered before it, reading the extended placard that told the full story of Catherine Devereux's vision, Thaddeus Harrington's attempted theft, and Augustus Crane's 40-year protection of cultural heritage. "Mr. Crane?" A museum docent approached. "Dr. Volkmer would like you to meet someone." They were led through the galleries to a quieter room where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, studying a small Renaissance portrait with tears streaming down her face. The woman was perhaps 90, with elegant white hair and eyes that still held remarkable clarity. "Mr. Crane," Dr. Volkmer said quietly, "this is Dorothy Ashcroft. She was Catherine Devereux's personal secretary before the fire." Victor knelt beside the wheelchair, suddenly aware he was in the presence of someone who'd actually known the people behind the story. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Ashcroft. The honor is mine." Her voice was frail but steady. "I've waited 70 years to see these pieces again. I helped Catherine catalog this collection. I wrote the descriptions in her estate inventory. I thought they were gone forever." She reached out and gripped Victor's hand with surprising strength. "Your grandfather gave me back something I thought I'd lost. Not just the art, but proof that beauty and goodness can survive even when evil tries to destroy them. Did you know my grandfather?" "Augustus Crane? I met him once, years after the fire. I'd been searching for answers about what really happened that night. Someone suggested I speak with him. He'd been at the estate shortly after." Dorothy's eyes grew distant with memory. "He wouldn't tell me much. Said it wasn't safe, that some secrets had to stay buried. But he looked me in the eye and said, 'The collection lives. It's protected.' That's all I can tell you. I thought he was being cryptic or perhaps a bit confused. I never imagined. Her voice broke. Petra knelt beside Victor, offering Dorothy a tissue. Your grandmother worked for the family too, didn't she? Margot Ashton's grandmother? Alice was my sister-in-law. We were both there that night. Both barely escaped the fire. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly. The official story never made sense. Catherine was careful about electrical systems, paranoid almost after a small fire years before. And those men who'd been asking questions the week before the fire, the arguments we'd overheard between Catherine and her attorney, it all pointed to something darker. Thaddeus Harrington, Victor said quietly. Yes, but we couldn't prove anything. 2 housekeepers against a powerful attorney. We'd have been dismissed, possibly worse. Dorothy looked at the painting again. Alice spent her life trying to find the truth. She died never knowing. I'm grateful I lived long enough to see this, to know Catherine's legacy is safe. They spent an hour with Dorothy, listening to her stories about Catherine Devereux, a woman who'd believed art belonged to everyone, who'd opened her home for educational tours, who'd planned to donate the collection to museums before her death. The woman Harrington had murdered for profit. When Dorothy was wheeled away by her grandson, Victor felt the full weight of what Augustus had accomplished. He hadn't just saved objects. He'd preserved memory, honored the dead, ensured that evil didn't triumph completely. The formal program began at 7. Speeches from museum directors, art historians, even the state attorney general, whose investigation had exposed decades of Harrington family fraud. Margot spoke about her grandmother and the long search for justice. Alistair discussed the collection's artistic significance. Then they called Victor to the podium. He'd prepared notes, but found himself unable to read them. Instead, he spoke from the heart, looking out at the hundreds of faces, scholars, collectors, journalists, ordinary people who loved art. My grandfather, Augustus Crane, wasn't a hero when this started, Victor began. He was a working man who restored paintings for a living. But when he saw something wrong, something evil, he made a choice. Not the easy choice, not the profitable choice, but the right one. He described finding the house, the trapdoor, the underground chamber. Described reading Augustus's journals and understanding the sacrifice his grandfather had made. Described the decision to fight rather than compromise with thieves. Augustus lived with his secrets for 40 years, died without ever seeing justice done. He gave up comfort, security, even relationships to protect something he believed mattered more than personal happiness. Victor's voice caught. I didn't understand that kind of sacrifice until recently, until I lost my wife and had to decide what kind of man I wanted to be in her absence. He saw Petra in the front row, tears on her face, but smiling with pride. My grandfather taught me something these past months, even though he's been gone for years. He taught me that integrity isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about the choices you make when no one's watching, the burdens you carry because someone has to. The harder right over, the easier wrong. Victor looked at the masterpiece, glowing under museum lights. Catherine Devereux wanted this collection shared with the world. Augustus made sure that could happen. And now finally her vision is reality. Not because of wealth or power, but because one man chose honor over profit. Chose to protect rather than exploit. He stepped back from the podium to sustained applause, feeling exhausted and relieved. Petra hugged him tightly, whispering, "Perfect." It was perfect. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and congratulations. Journalists requested interviews. Museums asked about his plans. Someone from PBS wanted to do a documentary. Victor deflected most of it, letting Sylvia handle the details. As the crowd thinned, he found himself alone in the central gallery, standing before the masterpiece one final time. He pulled out the photograph he'd been carrying since the beginning, Augustus standing in front of the house, young and proud and full of purpose. "We did it," Victor whispered to the image. "Your legacy is safe. Your choices mattered. And I finally understand what you were trying to teach me all along." Petra appeared beside him, linking her arm through his. "Ready to go home?" Home. The word settled warmly in his chest. The house that had been a last resort had become a sanctuary. The town that had seemed like exile had become community. The burden that had seemed impossible had become purpose. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." They walked out together into the New York evening, father and daughter, survivors of loss who'd found meaning in honoring the past. Tomorrow they'd fly back, return to their restored house and quiet lives. But tonight, standing on the museum steps with the city lights spreading before them, Victor allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. 8 months after the exhibition opening, Victor sat at his grandfather's desk, his desk now, compiling the final pages of a project that had consumed his evenings for weeks. The leather-bound volume before him represented months of careful work, a comprehensive catalogue of every piece in Augustus's collection, complete with provenance, Augustus's original notes, and the full historical context of each item's journey. Sunlight streamed through the study windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the warm air. The house had transformed completely from the rotting structure he and Petra had first encountered. New windows gleamed. Fresh paint covered walls that had been water-damaged and peeling. The floors had been refinished to their original luster. But more than physical restoration, the house felt alive again, filled with purpose and memory and love. Petra appeared in the doorway, laptop under her arm. "Dad," the publisher called. "They want to move the release date up. Apparently pre-orders are already strong." The catalogue would be published by a university press, becoming both a permanent record of Augustus's work and a reference text for art historians. Victor had insisted all proceeds go to the Art Education Fund established in Catherine Devereux's name. It seemed appropriate, turning Augustus's careful documentation into something that would help others appreciate beauty. "Whatever they think is best," Victor said, setting down his pen. "How's the business?" Petra's design firm had launched 3 months earlier. Working from home, she'd built a client list that kept her busy but not overwhelmed. The stability gave her freedom to be selective, to work on projects she cared about, rather than taking anything that paid. Good. Really good, actually. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where they'd planned their legal strategy, where they'd made decisions that changed everything. "I got invited to speak at a design conference next month, about building a business based on values rather than just profit." Victor smiled. "Your mother would be so proud of you." "I'm proud of you. I learned from the best." Petra's voice was soft. "Both of you. Mum teaching me to stand by people I love. You teaching me that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." A knock at the front door interrupted them. Victor rose, surprised they weren't expecting visitors. When he opened the door, he found Francine standing on the porch with a covered dish and a hesitant smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "I made too much stew, and I know how you two eat when you're working." It was a transparent excuse. Francine was always bringing food, always checking on them, but Victor had learned to accept kindness gracefully. "Come in." We were about to take a break anyway. Over lunch in the kitchen they'd fully restored, Francine shared town gossip. The Historical Society wanted Victor to lead a workshop on document preservation. The library had received a donation to start an art lending program, inspired by the news coverage of Augustus's collection. Small ripples spreading outward from the choices made in this house. "Your grandfather would be amazed," Francine said. "He spent his life working in secret, and now his story is inspiring people everywhere." "I think he'd be uncomfortable with the attention," Victor said, "but pleased that it's making a difference." After Francine left, Victor returned to the study and the final pages of the catalogue. He'd saved one task for last, writing the introduction that would frame everything else. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, searching for words adequate to the task. Finally, he began typing. This catalogue documents more than a collection of valuable objects. It records one man's lifelong commitment to protecting beauty and truth when both were threatened. Augustus Crane spent 40 years bearing a burden he could have abandoned at any time. He chose the harder path, the lonelier path, because he believed some things matter more than personal comfort. In compiling this catalogue, I've come to understand my grandfather in ways I never could when he was alive. His meticulous records reveal not just a guardian of art, but a man of profound principle. Every entry shows his care, his respect for the artists and the objects they created. Every note demonstrates his awareness that he was temporary, a custodian protecting treasures for future generations. The collection is now where it belongs, accessible to everyone, fulfilling Catherine Devereux's original vision. But this catalogue serves another purpose. It's a reminder that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices, that integrity matters, that one person, acting with courage and conscience, can preserve something precious against overwhelming odds. Augustus Crane never sought recognition. He did what he believed was right and lived with the consequences. In the end, that may be the most valuable legacy of all, not the art he saved, but the example he set. Victor read it through once, then closed the file. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That would have to be enough. Evening fell softly over the property. Victor walked outside, something he did most nights now, touring the grounds that Augustus had let fall into neglect while protecting secrets underground. The garden was thriving again. Petra had taken up landscaping as a hobby, planting flowers and vegetables in soil that hadn't been worked in decades. He found himself at the spot where he'd first stood with Petra, looking at the sagging house and wondering if they could survive. 9 months ago, a lifetime ago, everything had changed. His phone buzzed with a text from Alistair. Just got news. The Smithsonian's touring exhibition sold out in 3 cities. Augustus's story is resonating with people. Victor pocketed the phone, looking up at the house where lights glowed warmly from windows. His house, his home, built by his grandfather, neglected by time, restored by necessity, and now alive again with purpose and meaning. Inside, he found Petra cooking dinner, humming along to music playing from her phone. The scene was so beautifully ordinary, it made his chest ache. This was what Augustus had protected in his own way, the possibility of this moment. Family, home, peace earned through principle. Dad. Petra looked up from the stove. You okay? Yeah. Victor moved to help her, falling into the comfortable rhythm of shared tasks. Just thinking about how far we've come, from eviction to museum exhibitions. It's been quite a journey. I was thinking more about the things that matter, you, this house. The choices we made. Victor paused, searching for the right words. When I lost your mother, when the Hargroves turned their backs on us, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd lost everything that mattered, but you hadn't. No, I'd lost some things, but I hadn't lost myself. Hadn't lost you. Hadn't lost the ability to choose who I wanted to be. He met her eyes. Augustus gave me that gift. Not the collection, not the money, the reminder that broken things can be rebuilt. That even when everything falls apart, you can still choose integrity. They ate dinner together, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Afterward, Victor returned to the study one last time, standing before the photograph of Augustus that he'd framed and hung on the wall. Thank you, he said simply, for trusting me, for teaching me, for showing me that some things are worth more than money, that some things must be protected at all costs. The photograph offered no response, but Victor didn't need one. He understood now what Augustus had tried to tell him across the decades. Legacy wasn't about wealth or recognition. It was about the choices you made when everything was on the line. The person you decided to be when being that person cost you everything. Victor turned off the study light and climbed the stairs to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, the ordinary business of living. But tonight, he slept peacefully in the house his grandfather had built, in the life he'd rebuilt from ruins, surrounded by love and purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done the right thing. Some things are worth more than money. Some things must be protected at all costs. Augustus had been right all along, and Victor had finally learned the lesson.